And therefore, the work of the ancestors was not in vain. It wasn't bulldozed, it wasn't lost in the forest. It was given rebirth for a new generation in a new time.
As you are aware, historic Bridgetown and its garrison has been inscribed on the UNESCO World Heritage List. Dr. Lennox Honeychurch of Dominica knows what it is to be a citizen of an island that already has an inscription. He is a historian, an anthropologist, an archaeologist, an author, and an artist. He is well known throughout the Eastern Caribbean for his wealth of knowledge of history and heritage. He has authored many books, including The Caribbean People. His latest major project has been the successful restoration of the Shirley's Fort in the Cabrit's National Park in Dominica. In 2011, Dr. Lennox Honeychurch received the Anthony N. Sabba Caribbean Award for Excellence for his dedication and continuing service to preserving Dominica's heritage and promoting local culture at home and throughout the region. Dr. Honeychurch is eminently qualified to speak to us on the topic of heritage. As expected, he begins with a definition of the word.
Well, as the word implies, heritage is that which is inherited from the past for any country. And so the heritage of a community, a heritage of a country, is those parts of culture, of way of life, of material culture, of objects that have been inherited from the past. Even if they're no longer used, but that they are still evident and that they tell something of the way in which we have come to the present time. And this is really the great thing about heritage. It is understanding the past so that we can understand and make sense of the present. Because so often people just look at everything at face value for what it is at the present, and they don't then fully understand what happened in the past.
Having defined heritage, Dr. Honeychurch takes a deeper look at the word, detailing its tangible and intangible nature. He underscores the importance of preserving these artifacts of our past.
In terms of heritage, one could look at it as the tangible and the intangible. The tangible, of course, is that which you can see and feel and walk through and handle. The intangible are those things which are part of the heritage that a lot of it is verbal, has been handed down either in writing or in patterns of language and dance and creativity, knowledge of various types of attitudes towards agriculture, to farming, recipes, a wide variety of things which rests in knowledge. Knowledge which has been handed down, and knowledge of different groups of people. I mean, the fishermen of Barbados or Dominica or St. Lucia have an amazing understanding and knowledge of the sea and of the fish and the methods of fishing and weather and swells and this kind of stuff. And here is this bank of intangible knowledge which is lost with them. And that is the real frightening thing about the intangible heritage. It resides in the minds of people. And those people would have had to be in connection with other people, older people from years gone by, or in certain professions which perhaps are no longer active. Let's, for instance, talk about cobblers, people who make shoes. You know, less and less do you have knowledge about this. Blacksmiths, in the old sense of the word, no longer with welding, you know, torches and stuff like that, but in the old days, with having to put on, for instance, horseshoes and things like this. So there's all this intangible heritage, this knowledge related to the objects. So yes, you have the objects. You have a cassava grater, for instance, for making cassava. But the whole use of it and the methods of using it have to be explained and interpreted. So you've got this bank of heritage there that is intangible. And then you have the tangible heritage, that which you can see and feel, either in objects or in buildings and landscape, the way the landscape has been adapted in one way or another. So for instance, if we're talking about objects going way back into pre-Columbian Barbados, you have an amazing variety of pottery from the Amerindian people that lived in Barbados. But sometimes you just don't know what it was for or how it was used, simply because the people have disappeared. The vast genocide that happened in the early part of Caribbean history of the indigenous people. So we find these objects and we have difficulty in explaining. But in a place like Barbados, which had this massive dependency on the coral reef, you have these wonderful creations out of conch shells. And that is tangible heritage of a Barbados that has completely disappeared. And then you have all that tangible heritage related to sugar. The actual pieces of machinery and bits and pieces like the sugar loaves, the cones for draining the sugar, that are no longer used, but because we have the books and the documents to explain them, we know what they were used for. So you have these objects of tangible heritage, and then of course the buildings. For instance, we know about the production of sugar, but we need to preserve certain areas where we can actually walk through buildings which explain the production of sugar. And then you have, in terms of the tangible heritage, the grand history, the so-called high history and heritage of the controlling forces. Behind me here, for instance, is the garrison and parts of the garrison surrounding us. And this is a story of the ultimate power that controlled the colony of Barbados, or the garrisons in St. Lucia, Dominica, wherever, in Antigua. These tell us about the power that controlled. Because, you can read in a book that Barbados was under colonial rule and that the people within Barbados were under the army direction. But unless you have the tangible heritage to be able to be there, to fully understand the extent of that power and the investment that was being made, because when you look around, just taking the Barbados garrison here and the St. Anne's garrison as an example, you realize the massive amount of investment that went into this. Then you ask questions about why were they investing in this? It links us to sugar. And the fact that sugar was as valuable as oil is today. It was the highest valued commodity in the world at the time. There was no commodity higher than sugar in the 18th century and the late 17th century. And so the buildings explain to us how important that thing was to the European powers and why, in this case, the British were prepared to make these massive investments to protect themselves, their island, against other European powers, and to ensure that they had a controlling power over the vast thousands of the enslaved population. And if these buildings were not here, we would not fully understand the extent to which this control was in force. And that is the tangible heritage, and that is why it is important to understand it and at least to keep some examples so that we can interpret our heritage and understand why we have come to where we are today.
In explaining why we need to safeguard and preserve these tangibles and the intangible, Dr. Honeychurch reminds us that although the trappings of oppression are sometimes evident in these, we must remind ourselves that oppression and the victory over oppression is, in many cases, the story of our heritage.
There is a school of thought, and I have to deal with it quite often in the work that I do in Dominica, that why should we even bother about preserving these things? Why should we bother about all of these great houses and forts and stuff that were parts of the whole system of oppression? But you see, oppression and the victory over oppression is the story of our heritage. And therefore we must understand and see the objects of that oppression to be able to understand the achievement that has been made. But we must not only do, as was done during colonial times in the early mid-20th century. There were people in each of our islands that realized the value of this heritage and began to preserve it. Understandably, at the beginning, in the 1930s, in the 40s, What these people were, that middle class, that upper class, were actually part of the colonial tradition. And therefore what they saw as important were the plantation houses, the military forts, and the objects of the plantocracy. If you went to the Barbados Museum up to the 1980s, the main galleries were filled with china and silver and crystal from the plantation houses. It told you very little about the enslaved population or about the independent peasantry that emerged in Barbados and the Caribbean after emancipation. So that is why now, the new generation have to understand that besides the story of the plantation house, of the military garrisons, of the mills and boiling houses, there is also need to preserve the heritage of the independent peasantry, of the enslaved, of the working class, that then became the new elite in the late 20th century, early 21st century. And the journey that these people took, because we have in many of our islands remnants of slave huts, also areas of agriculture. What kind of fruit and vegetables and crops did this early free people, group of free people, depend on? And how did they live and network within their areas? And what villages did they have and that kind of thing? So that is another important area, and I do notice that in certain parts of Barbados, efforts are being made to focus on that section of our heritage as well.
Dr. Honeychurch further explains that this should not be seen merely as something for the student of history and heritage, but something for everyone, for an understanding of your heritage is essential for every profession.
So essentially what one is trying to do is to maintain examples, physical examples, of the broad heritage from the Amerindian, why did they disappear, what they had, into the whole plantation slavery colonial section, and then, very importantly, into the area of advancement from 1838, when a people basically began with nothing, virtually nothing, and by 150 years had built themselves into an independent, self-governing, educated people. And this is a remarkable story. And so the evidences of it must be there to be preserved. We cannot depend simply on textbooks and on reading. You know, I always say, these places are important for education. People promote them for tourism. But education is a key area because it is better than a textbook. If you have a good teacher and you go onto any of these sites, it is something that those students are never going to forget, and they are going to build it into their understanding of the world. And the other thing is, you don't just have to be a historian or a student who is specializing and majoring in history to understand these things. You could be an accountant in business management. When you're managing your business, it is good for you in your country to understand how the process of business and the hub of economy for the Eastern Caribbean, for instance, emerged in Barbados, and why it was that it was there, and how it developed itself, and who the former businessmen were, and how the whole business climate in Barbados changed. So you don't have to be just a person, you know, keen on historical buildings and houses to understand and to need to understand these things.
Underscoring the importance of preserving examples of that tangible and intangible heritage to ensure that we continue with a sense of that traveled road, and of course it also gives us a sense of where we are going.
In Dominica, as in many of the islands of the Eastern Caribbean, there are groups and individuals who are working towards preserving some of the tangible heritage. Intangible as well, we have people preserving folk songs and knowledge of various traditions. But in Dominica particularly, the work that I am involved in is the restoration of a major garrison, the most important historic site in Dominica, which exists in the north of the island. It's called the Cabritz Garrison. And essentially, it is rather like the garrison here, but you have to imagine it perched on two hills in the middle of the forest. It was far from the main town, and whereas the garrison here in Barbados, once the troops pulled out, the buildings were either sold or they were maintained by government to be rented as apartments or be turned into a museum or offices and this kind of thing. In the case in Dominica, this was off in the forest on hills. And once the British moved out in 1854 and closed the place, the forest just took over. And what we have been doing since the 1980s is peeling back the forest and rebuilding the buildings for modern purposes, education, tourism. And one of the key areas that we are working on is an educational center, the Cabritz Heritage and Ecology Center, where young people will be able to come and camp. We'd have dormitory facilities, etc., and be able to spend a weekend, a week. Barbadians, for instance, coming to Dominica, Cadet Corps, Boy Scouts, these kind of things could come and then stay in the area and use that as a base for understanding about the ecology and heritage of that part of Dominica. So it is an educational project, but it's also, of course, like most things in our economy today, tied to tourism as well. And then also, it's preserving, for future generations, so that we can understand, as I have mentioned, why these things are where they are today.
Well, a little vision and foresight, and today Shirley's Fort stands as a National Heritage Site in Dominica and, of course, as an income generator for the island. Dr. Honeychurch calls attention to something that is very often overlooked by many when the question of restoration of a colonial building is raised. He goes on to share the benefits of his restored Shirley's Fort in Dominica.
Already at Fort Shirley, the main site that we are restoring, we have been able to hold various events. The main building that we're working on is officers' quarters, beautiful classic Georgian building. We have to remember, with all of these forts and garrisons all over the Caribbean, that the actual work, the actual skills were done by African Caribbean people. And that this is another angle towards preserving these things. It is not only a matter that these things were part of the colonial oppressive system and were buildings that really controlled everything, but it is also who built them and the skills of the people who built them.
Well, good news indeed. Today, the ancestors of those who sweat blood and tears built the structures at the Cabritz National Park in Dominica are enjoying and making use of the building and the entire compound.
And so when we restore these things, as we have done in Dominica, we restored the officers' quarters, and we had our first wedding. We have a number now, but the first one was the son of one of the guys who was working as a stonemason on the project. And it was a really beautiful time, because if one had any understanding of the past and the move to the present, one could not be touched by the fact that here in the building under the candelabra and chandeliers where officers, white British officers, once were in control and once were entertaining themselves. Here are the descendants of the enslaved, the people who worked 200 years ago on this building, who are now working on restoring it. And they are the true inheritors of what has happened. And on evenings like that, it is extremely touching, to think that here was once a kind of select preserve, and now it is open to the new independent generations of Dominicans. And therefore the work of the ancestors was not in vain. It wasn't bulldozed, it wasn't lost in the forest. It was given rebirth for a new generation in a new time.
Dr. Honeychurch is pleased with Dominica's present inscription and hopes that the Cabritz will be listed very soon. We also learn of plans to have a trans-boundary World Heritage Site comprising of the forts of the Eastern Caribbean.
In Dominica, we already have one of the World Heritage Sites. That is the Tuapito National Park. And it is one of the few natural heritage, World Heritage Sites in the Caribbean. There are others in Belize. There are also in places like Haiti and Cuba and St. Kitts, Brimstone Hill, a number of World Heritage cultural sites. The Cabritz, maybe one of these days, would be part of this site. But at present, what UNESCO is looking at in the Eastern Caribbean to do with its fortifications is to have what they call a trans-boundary site. So you would have a World Heritage Site that would be the forts of the Eastern Caribbean. So that the Garrison, Brimstone Hill in St. Kitts, Fort Charlotte in St. Vincent, the whole complex of forts in St. George's, Grenada, the site in Dominica, even those in Martinique and Guadeloupe perhaps, would form a regional World Heritage Site, and that visitors who go up and down the islands are visiting, when they visit an island, part of an extended trans-boundary World Heritage Site. So that's a very interesting concept that's coming up now, because sometimes you haven't got to see these things in individual island systems. It was all part of one connected defense system from one island to the next. So in a way to understand it, you have to cross the boundaries of all our independent nations and think of it at a time when the British and the French empires controlled this line of islands and essentially were controlling all these lines of forts. So that's an example. Of course, there are others. You can use it with plantations and stuff, where a site is not necessarily of world importance by itself, but as linked up to a regional connection, it then gains the status of understanding an aspect of human history within a particular region, in this case, the Eastern Caribbean.
Well, the research component of that human heritage that will enable us to understand the heritage of the Eastern Caribbean will no doubt be found in many of our information centers. As expected, Dr. Honeychurch calls attention to these. He sadly laments the present state of our libraries, archives, and museums, and urges the authorities to recognize the important role these institutions play in our societies.
All over our islands, there is this big move for education, and particularly for the extension of tertiary education. Now, when you get into a university or college education, you really require the sources for research. And those sources have to be maintained and preserved. And therefore, it is important that we look at our library system, our museums, and our sites. But I want to concentrate really on the libraries, because they traditionally have been the bank of knowledge in terms of documentation and other aspects. Once again, we follow the story of post-emancipation Caribbean, particularly in the British Caribbean, and we see gradually in the 19th century the establishment of these libraries by groups of people who are interested in education. But the problem now is, in most of our islands, is that the political directorate are consumed with more day-to-day urgent matters, and investment in libraries, for instance, are not seen as priority, are not seen as important. So most of us in the islands are actually trying to run library services in buildings that are well over 100 years old. And when you think, as I say in Dominica, we have a wonderful, charming, small public library that, like many libraries up and down the islands, was built with funds from the Carnegie Foundation. The Carnegie libraries, you can find them up and down. But that building was opened 100 years ago, just over 100 years ago, in 2007. The size of it, the square footage of it has not changed. And yet the student population of Dominica, has, over 500% more than it was when that thing was opened. And yet you're trying to put space for computers, you're trying to put space for files, you're trying to serve students who are doing these SBAs for CXC. All of these things that, were not there before. And you're trying to maintain a 100-year-old building to service that kind of thing. And your political directorate, and I'm not talking of a specific party, I'm talking about all parties across the board, tend to have a feeling that it's something that could just stay there while we mind our business with other matters that we feel are more urgent. But the thing is, education is the key to the survival of our islands in so many aspects. I mean, when you think of the problems with world trade and with our sugar and bananas and whatever, the knowledge and skill of our people is what is going to see us through. And therefore, the investment into things like libraries is crucial and important. And it's tragic to hear, for instance, what has happened to the main public library in Barbados and the way in which it more or less has been abandoned. But I know that throughout the islands, the librarians and the library staff are having a great deal of problems with this. The next thing is archives, which are usually part of the library service. These, in this kind of climate, it's extremely difficult to maintain them. But they are valuable documents that tell us of the past and that are needed by our students in tertiary education. They needed these things to be able to qualify in their degrees. And therefore it is vital that the facilities to maintain these documents is provided. Sadly, I mean, you know, very often people in Dominica say, well, where do you get all this information? I say, well, every so often I go to Britain and I go into the National Archives of Britain, formerly called the Public Records Office, and I find all the information I need about Dominica and the rest of the Caribbean. And they'll say, but why these documents are not here? I said, look, I am happier, in all honesty, to bring a photocopy to Dominica and store it than to bring the actual document. Because the condition in which those documents in Britain are preserved and protected and maintained, we could never, certainly with the present state of mind, involve ourselves with maintaining them in that state, very good state. So sometimes it's better that these things stay in their metropolitan museums and archives than come down here and be neglected and rot and that kind of thing. We can still use them. We have all kinds of things like digital preservation and stuff like that. We could use the information on the documents. We don't have necessarily to have the document or the artifact here with us until we are prepared to invest in proper facilities to maintain our heritage. And this is a key point that we have to consider.
Well, the preservation of our heritage is possible because of the efforts of a number of individuals who understand the importance and value of these things. Dr. Honeychurch refers to these as Renaissance men and women of the Caribbean, and as expected, he commends them.
Up and down our islands, there are Renaissance men and women who, for one reason or another, have committed themselves in various ways, either to preserving, highlighting, maintaining, promoting in the media the heritage of their islands. These are valuable national treasures, these individuals. And they fight mercilessly sometimes against ignorance and blindness. Buildings collapse, cannons are taken, and people desecrate archaeological sites without proper research and that kind of thing. There has to be this balance between development and between this preservation of our heritage. Because if we simply let our islands become concrete jungles for the benefit and for the mercy of international metropolitan powers, whether they be private powers or international powers, we will be robbed of our whole identity and personality. And that is why it is so important that there are individuals in all of our islands that are willing to stick their heads above the parapet and stand up to protect and to ensure that future generations can have the benefits of these aspects of our tangible as well as intangible heritage. They are priceless national service that these people are doing. And I just want to place on record my admiration for all my friends up and down the islands who are in the struggle.
And Dr. Honeychurch on the importance of preserving our heritage. It somehow reminds us of a slogan used in Barbados in 2007, and I quote, "A proud past and a world-class future." Perhaps I could borrow from that and say, a proud past which has now been declared a world-class heritage site. Special thanks to Dr. Lennox Honeychurch, and of course we wish him continued success with his many projects in the Commonwealth of Dominica, for indeed he is one of the Caribbean Renaissance men. Thank you for staying with me. I'm Sherwood McCaskey.